ready? We ready? Okay. So where we left off on Tuesday, we just finished talking about defense mechanisms. And again, the point of defense mechanisms is to kind of protect our sense of who we are and our identity. And we usually use these when we feel some type of threat. So someone claiming, for example, in the alcoholic uh, category, someone claiming that we have alcoholism or that we have a disease, and we're not ready to really accept that idea because it goes against who we feel we are as a human being, we will use things like denial or projection or displacement and those types of things. When we get to the cultural component, we'll find that these have slightly differentiations between cultures. Some cultures, um, you don't see much of things like displacement and rationalization like you do here in the United States. But we'll see that every culture kind of has some notion of things like denial and regression. So we'll see that there's some similarities and there's some differences. And I will say that these defense mechanisms are still used in therapy and whatnot today. As and they're now have labels like thinking errors, those types of things, and irrational thinking about the self is how they're used in therapy. But let's go on. Now, probably one of most of the controversial aspects of Freud's theory is his psychosexual stages of development. But it's kind of important to kind of rehearse this, as you all remember from the developmental section that we did. Um, Freud emphasized that there's about 5 stages of development, and he emphasized he was one of the first to develop what is called stage theory. Okay, stage theory is this notion, is this notion that um, we develop or we change over time in certain stages during certain periods of our life. Okay, and of course, definitely coming from a Western cultural perspective, as we noted in the developmental section, we tend to think of it as linear age-based. And as we will see again, coming back to this notion of personality when we get to the culture section, that in a lot of cultures, it's not necessarily seen this linear from birth to death and different stages within that. It tends to be more circular and more holistic. But Freud's theories had some huge influences, especially on Western cultures and the way we see culture. So it's kind of important to kind of look at these different stages to kind of understand where some of our Western concepts of early childhood development comes from. So we're going to look at kind of a Western cultural perspective on this and kind of understand kind of where we come from. Now, probably one of the most important parts of Freudian theory and psychoanalysis is, if you notice, he proposes that uh, basically we're fully developed by the age of 18, okay? And that by the age of 18, nothing else really happens, okay? We have our fully developed brain, we have our fully developed personality, and nothing beyond that changes. Okay. And this is one of the reasons, if you want to think about it this way, this is why one of the reasons why this age of 18 is considered the age of adulthood. It's very arbitrary. there's really nothing significant about being 18 from a developmental perspective, other than the culture deems you as an adult, albeit that you can't drink, but you can go to war. Kind of an odd combination. But this idea that adulthood starts at the age of 18 was reinforced by Freudian theory. Okay. And so that's one conception that we should understand. I would say if you take like Psych 240, Human Growth and Development, and courses like that, you will find that we continue to develop through the lifespan. Childhood is important, but it's not the only stage where we develop personality factors and intelligence and all of those psychological processes. Um, so I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to take a course like Human Growth and Development. All right, so let's though go through these stages and see how they have influenced Western culture. Okay. Now, I should say a lot of people think that Freud developed his developmental theory first and then developed his overall psychological theory. And if you look at his writings linearly and everything else, that's actually incorrect. He actually developed his developmental theory, his child development theory, after he had developed his theory of the id, ego, and superego. Okay. Now, by that time, though, his theory, he couldn't deviate from what he felt was the basis of his theory, which is human sexuality. Okay. And so, even though he really didn't want to make his developmental theory sexual in nature, he was kind of forced to based on the theory that he developed. Okay. And the basis of his theory is that, for example, if you take infant suckling, okay, um, those little guys and girls are working hard for their nutrition. All right. One of the reasons why breast milk is so full of fat or has a lot of fat in it is because fat metabolizes slower. Okay. Because if you actually look at the suckling and how little they actually get out of the nipple, even a bottle nipple, they're actually burning more calories while they're eating than they're taking in, but it's because of the fat content that keeps them keeps the nutrients in them and all those kinds of things. Okay. And so this is a very laborious activity. And so Freud kind of thought that there has to be some type of motivational force that makes it so that the infant will ingest nutrients from the mother. Okay. And of course, he went back to his id and his sexual theory and said there must be something gratifying for the infant in order to make it so they'll suckle. Okay. Gratification in Freudian terms is spelled Sexual. Okay. Pleasure is spelled Sexual in Freudian terms. And so what he felt is in order to become a fully developed adult, at each stage, in order to get us to get from child to adult, we must have some type of pleasure or gratification within some zone of our body. Okay. If you've heard the term erogenous zones, this is a Freudian notion that there's certain spots on the body that bring about some type of pleasure. Okay. All right. So in the first stage of development, which he argued was between about 0 to 18 months, is the oral stage of development. And he believed that if we come to control our gratifying need for oral intake, then we successfully go on to the next stage and we're able to not become what's called pleasure seekers. So someone who is orally fixated, which means they never overcame the need to ingest orally, are people who are pleasure-centered thinkers. Okay. They're pleasure seekers in a sense. For Freud, going into adulthood, he believed that he was orally fixated. Okay. Because Sigmund Freud actually died of jaw cancer because he had to have 2 or 3 cigars every day. I believe it was since the age of 12 or 13, he had to have a cigar. Okay. Um, he also believed that this explains things like addiction um, and obesity. Okay. Now, you probably have all heard of calorie reducing diets and everything like that. And I hope that if you take a good science class and stuff like that, they will tell you that that's not what creates obesity. Most obese individuals don't eat any more than non-obese individuals. But this idea that people become obese because they eat too much is a Freudian notion. So if you go to your nutritionist or you go to your doctor and they say reduce your calories or reduce this, this is a Freudian notion. It's not based in actual science. So this is one thing that has kind of stuck in Western culture, that people must be overweight because they overeat. Um, and certainly there are some individuals where that is the case, but for the mass majority of people who have excess weight, it's not necessarily because they ingest too much food. Now, to emphasize the influence this had on Western culture, pre-Freudian theory, men who were large, who had some extra pounds on them in Western society, were seen as healthy, vibrant, strong, wealthy, because at that time, to be overweight, you must have access to food. Back then, the food wasn't as accessible as it is today. So men who were large were considered attractive and all of those types of things. And similarly with women. But then when Freudian theory took over Western culture and it became this thing about food being this sensual, this thing a person could not resist, then people who are big and large became people who are who can't inhibit themselves, can't control their needs and stuff like that. And that's when Western culture went from I'll use this word, idolizing larger men to idolizing thinner men. Okay. And that's all because of this theory that Freud developed. Okay. Now, in the next phase of Freud's theory is the anal phase. So, I've always felt that, we give out certificates and awards for graduating kindergarten, high school, getting married, college. We celebrate birthdays. I've always been confused at why there's no certificate or celebration for potty training. Now, follow my logic in this, okay? When a child is potty training, they're doing two really significant things. One, it's going to be the first time that they give in to the demands of an authority figure, such as a parent or a caregiver, to where they're going to obey someone outside of themselves to have some type of self-control, okay? The second significant thing has to do with that control. This is going to be the first time that we take charge of our biological processes, where we're going to decide, no, I'm not going to urinate or defecate right here and right now. I'm going to wait until I'm in this specific room during this specific time. Okay. So there's two significant things in the anal stage. One, we give in to the demands of an authority figure of some type. And two, we take internal control of our bodily functions for the first time. Okay. So again, people who learn to control this go on and be successful, those types of things. People who become anally fixated, and bring up another Western cultural concept that comes from Freud. If you've ever known someone who you call anal or who has been called anal, they tend to be quote unquote control freaks. They have to have everything perfect. Their closet is perfect. It's the person that comes in the room and says, "This is how today's going to go," and everyone needs to be a certain way, and those types of things. That's where the notion of being anal comes from, or another term that has been used is anal retentive. Okay, this is a Freudian notion. Because what Freud believed is a person who became anally fixated was someone who could not take internal control of themselves, so they put excessive control on their external environment. Okay, so there's a perfectionist, the person who wants to make sure everyone's doing what they need to do, those types of things. Okay, and again, this is a cultural transmission from a theory into a culture. Okay, um, the next phase, which we'll get into here in a minute, a little bit closer in here in a minute, is called the phallic stage. It happens between 3 to 6 years of age. Um, and during this phase, and is when, during at least Freudian times, a parent walks into a child taking a bath and they happen to be touching themselves in their private areas. Okay. Um, and so he believed that this is the genital phase. Now, I want to correct some of this, okay, because it's very important to differentiate between child sexuality and adult sexuality, okay? Um, because there's an important distinction. When a child is touching themselves in their private areas or erogenous zone areas, they're not doing it for necessarily sexual reasons. They're doing it because there's a huge bundle of nerves that send pleasure signals up to the brain, meaning they do it because it feels good. As adults, we transition to the combination of the psychological thought of someone else with the pleasuring of that part of the body. Okay. Now, this is a good advice for some parents. When you do find your child, one, don't shame them. Two, ask them, how did you learn to touch yourself there? And let me tell you the importance of that question. If they say, it just feels good, that's normal for children, very normal. If they say, well, so and so taught me or so and so showed me, then you have a problem because that denotes that there's been some abuse. So in this conversation, I know this is a class on culture, there's a little bit of parental advice you can take when you're asking your child those questions. Okay. So now, what happens when a child is unable to overcome the need to self-gratify themselves? Again, much like the oral phase of development, these individuals become high-risk pleasure seekers. So this is a person who will go bungee jumping off a 200 foot thing. They're constantly looking for that next high and that next pleasure. Okay. And so that's where the idea of pleasure seeking comes from. Okay. All right. So these last two phases, 6 years to puberty, he really didn't believe anything happened much during this phase. We got some talents and we learned math and reading and writing, but nothing really happens developmentally during this phase, which again in American and Western culture had a huge influence because if you look at research on child development, there's a big gap from the age of 6 to puberty, where most of the research doesn't come from looking at a child in the family setting. A lot of the research comes out of elementary education research. Um, so one of the downfalls of this, him saying there's nothing that really happens during this phase, is these children tend to be kind of ignored in a lot of ways. We don't really know a lot about this age group from a scientific perspective. And so this is the unfortunate part about that elementary age years is there's not a lot of focus on the child during this period. Okay. And then puberty to adulthood, we get our adult body, our adult things, and so we get sexual interests as adults, as mentioned earlier. Fantasies start to arise in the with the idea of sexual gratification. This is where we become we if we pass through the oral, anal, and phallic stages successfully, we will have normal adult healthy relationships and sexual relationships. If not, we might be, for example, the teen pregnancy or the person who goes and does high risk behaviors, those types of things. So that's Freudian theory. And I did want you to note some of the cultural influences of this theory. Okay. I thought there was a slide on this. Now, there is a one of the other cultural aspects of Freud's theory, as I mentioned this on Tuesday, is the whole notion of the relationship between the mother and the child. Okay. And again, Freudian theory didn't create this, but it reinforced it very much in our Western culture. If you look at Western culture pre-industrial, okay, the idea as the mother, as the caregiver, pretty much didn't exist. The infant-mother bond pretty much didn't exist because before in the industrial age, in Western culture, the relationship between mom and dad was not an intimate, loving relationship. It was a commodity utility relationship, meaning you married in order to work the farm, do those kinds of things. You had children, so you had labor to help with it. Usually it was either the grandparent or the eldest child who raised the infant into childhood, those types of things. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, which allowed a single family home income for a greater part of the 19th and 20th century, this allowed moms to develop motherhood as we see it today, as the mother, as the nurturer, primary caretaker, those types of relationships between the mother and the infant. Okay. When Freudian theory came along, Freud basically said, you know what? If the mother screws up, the child will not be a very good adult. Okay. And he put a lot of pressure on that mother-child relationship in order to note that the development of a child is dependent upon the relationship between the parent and the infant. Okay. So this notion of parent guilt, your child grows up and they're not doing so well, and that self-blame the parent puts on themselves. I'm going to put this again in Western culture. This goes back to Freudian psychoanalytic thinking. Okay. If we look at other cultures that say it's, the community that raises a child, you see less of that parental guilt as you go through adulthood because it's the community, not the parent, that is ultimately responsible for that child's development. But these are just some Western, again, looking at it from a Western lens, this is the influence this type of theory had on Western thought and Western ideas. Okay. So, what about today? We talked about how Freud has influenced popular culture and thought. We talked about oral fixation, being anal, those types of things. Um, but what about some of the other things? Because the problem with Freud's theory, as you'll see down in here, is that it's not, we can't test his theory from a scientific perspective because it's a circular theory. And so this is one of the problems with Freud's theory is it's not very well examined by scientific observation. But there are some relations between different areas of science that we can make that kind of emphasize some of these Freudian notions. So, for example, in neurological science, we do process information emotionally, unconsciously, before we're aware of it consciously. And I bring up the example of wanting to slap someone in the past in this class. We now know through brain imaging that things like sex and intimate love are associated with basic primary drive areas of the brain. And just as you would probably guess from Freudian theory, sex and intimate love do not travel the same neural tracks. Okay. In the brain, sex and intimate love are two completely separate processes. In fact, the sexual and intimate love tracks run on the opposite sides of the brain. Okay. So this idea that intimate love and sex are tied together, yes, there is. You got to, to develop a family and all of those types of things. Yes, you have to have the combination of the two. But human sexuality and human intimate love in the brain are two separate processes. In social psychology, we've noted the importance of the implicit attitudes that we talked about earlier in the course, and that how we process social information is done on an automatic and deliberate level, meaning that a lot of times we do unconsciously and automatically process information. Okay. In general psychology, we know that cognitions are influenced by implicit memories. Okay. So when we find ourselves in a similar situation as the past, even though we're not consciously recalling the memories of being in that situation, unconsciously those past memories are influencing how we behave today. I think I've given this example in this class before. Here I am, your professor, I have a PhD, all of these things, educated and everything else. But when I go home to Idaho, I act like the little dumb brother. Um, because not because I want to, but because the implicit memories of my familial situation are influencing the way I behave. And I will tell you, it drives my wife nuts. But that's an example of how implicit memories can really influence our behavior, even when we don't want to behave a certain way. Okay. And then, of course, we do have to note the scientific observations. It's not provable or disprovable, but these are some of the ways that we can relate some of Freudian concepts to what we see. Okay. All right. So now there are some post-Freudian people that are important for us to talk about because they're going to de-emphasize a lot of the sexual aspects of Freud's theory and are going to bring about some important things that we should note. Okay. Karen Horney, um, uh, stated that sex is not our primary drive, but security is. And she it will be an important figure when we talk about culture because she believed culture and society influences personality, not just these internal drives. Because what we seek is not necessarily uh, sexuality, it's security and filling of place and idea. Okay. Carl Jung gave us two kind of important concepts, especially when it comes to culture. The first one is what he called the collective unconscious. Um, if you again in the Native American communities, we talk a lot about what's called historical trauma and how historical trauma can influence our behaviors today. And this kind of traces back to Carl Jung. In fact, a lot of your native scholars who talk about historical trauma can trace some of these ideas back to Carl Jung's collective unconscious. Okay. Because what he felt is that we do have this impersonal, deepest layer of unconscious mind shown by everyone through our ancestry, that we have this drive based on ancestry that move us and drive some of our behavior. And this became kind of, if you want to put it this way, the ancestor of things like historical trauma, those types of topics that are very prevalent in Native American communities. And I will say, on that note, from a cultural perspective and about historical trauma, are we finding more and more hard evidence for this idea? Yes, we have. I'm waiting for a replication of a study that was done in, I think it was 2017 or 2019, somewhere in that time period, where a researcher found actually genetic markers of where historical trauma is kind of stored on our in our genes. And so I'm waiting for replication on that. We don't want to base the idea on one single study, but there does seem to be this growing evidence that this collective unconscious is actually imprinted on our genetic code. Okay. And really specifically to the collective unconscious, Jung came up with the notion of archetypes. Okay. Now, here we will differentiate between cultures, but some archetypes that are an example here is, for example, the enema or woman, who in Western culture tend to be passive. Okay, and this is where the cultural component comes in. Animus, man, assertive. Um, Persona is your public mask. And if you look across cultures, we have notions of villains and we have notions of heroes. So we are born with the symbolic understanding of women, men wearing a public mask. And in every society we've studied, there's the notion of someone who is people who are villains and people who are heroes. Now, this is where we do have to be careful because if you look at the slide, he says anima, woman, passive, animus, man, assertive. Not all cultures see women as passive, and not all cultures see men as assertive. But all cultures have a tendency to know women, men. Okay. So we have to be kind of careful with Jungian's archetypes. He did base it on Western cultural understanding, but we do know that we are all born with the notion of woman, man, mother, hero, and villain. And I want to go back to the mother one. It's not listed here. In almost all cultures, there is a representation of mother. However, we do caution is that across cultures, we don't always see an archetype of father. Okay. So when we look at archetypes and we look at parents, yes, across cultures, we see archetypes of mother, but not necessarily father. Okay. So, but Jung kind of emphasized these ideas that we all are kind of born with these different symbols and ideas of people from our past and people who exist across cultures in every culture. Okay. And then the last one is Alfred Adler, which I think a lot of people, especially in Western culture, really can relate to because he came up with the notion of individual psychology. People are motivated by their own purpose and goals. If you notice, this has a huge ring of individualism and Western psychology, okay? And that perfection, not pleasure, is the key motivators for individuals, okay? Now, he did emphasize that social factors are more important than, huh, this makes no sense. Social factors are more important than social factors. This should be social factors are more important than those drives that Freud introduced. Okay. And again, this is another kind of Western notion that comes from Adler. Um, yeah, well, is that we are all seeking superiority to adapt and master the environment. Okay. What Adler believed is we were born inferior, which, if you think about it, we are. And that through that inferiority complex, we try to master and dominate our environment. Okay. And in this, I hope you're hearing a very huge ring of Western individualism, capitalism, those types of things that Adler is trying to promote and kind of reinforce. Okay. All right. So, um, the humanistic approach, just to kind of give some understanding in the humanistic approach, which I think we did talk about briefly at the beginning of the semester. If you remember, this came out of the theory of existentialism or the philosophy of existentialism, where the ideas were born in a world of chaos, of meaninglessness, and that our goal is to create meaning out of nothing. Okay. Now, the reason why humanistic theories really went off with this is because that sets up the notion of free will, that we're all born with a choice to do what we want to do. Okay. This is a stark difference from psychoanalysis and even behaviorism, because psychoanalysis says all our behaviors are committed not because we choose to, but because the ego is compromising between the needs of the unconscious and the needs of our conscious world. So we actually don't choose to behave the way we do in pure psychoanalytic theory. If you think about learning theory, what reward, punishment, and associative learning, we don't choose to be where we're at today. It was our learning history that put us where we are today. Okay. Humanistic theory kind of wanted to bring back this notion of things like self-control, self-destiny, self-motivation. So they kind of took existentialism and said, based on this, we have free will. Okay. Um, the other part of humanistic theory is the idea that everyone has the capacity to solve their own problems. Okay. That we already have the knowledge to fix what's going on. It's just we need someone in our environment who can bring out the best of us. Okay. So probably the most famous humanistic theory that you'll see here in Western psychology is Abraham Maslow. If you do anything in human resources, psychology, treatment, you'll see this model over and over. Um, what Maslow believed is that we have these needs that we must satisfy in order to achieve something that he called self-actualization, which we'll define as a complete and total understanding of oneself right now. Okay. But he believed that we need to have some other needs in place before we could focus on self-actualization. Okay. The first one is physiological needs. So we need to be able to breathe air, eat food, drink water, sleep, those types of things, shelter. Um, and once we have these physiological needs met, we have to feel safe where we're at. So we there's no violence in the home. We live in a safe community. Those types of safe and stable community, I should say. And then on the next level, we have love and belonging. We have to have good relationships, good family relationships, those kinds of things. And then the last need we need to fulfill is our esteem needs. We have to feel like we're worthy. We have to have good self-esteem, depression and anxiety under control, those kinds of things. And only when we have these things in line can we become self-actualized or completely self-actualized. So you can imagine in this model how many people actually make it to a complete understanding of oneself, because how many times do we have all four of these in line? It's very, we could get a good job, get a house, feel safe, get married, but then what if we get divorced? Or what if we lose our job? Or what if we get through a bout of depression due to loss of someone? And so the notion of being self-actualized is almost reserved for the few, as you would say, in this model. Now, I mentioned again, when we look at this from a application perspective, I mentioned HR and human resources. We have found that a healthy organization pays a livable wage, uh, uh, have safety features at work, such as security guards, security systems. Employees have the opportunity to interact with other employees and develop working relationships. And the organization provides self-growth and classes and training opportunities and conferences. And we find that organizations who provide these four basic needs tend to be very high performing organizations. They make good money for their organization, meaning, okay. When we look at it from a clinical, psychological, counseling perspective, when you go in to see a good counselor, put that word good in front of them, they're going to do what's called a psychosocial history, where they're going to ask questions about your physical health, whether you feel safe at home, at school, at work. What is your relationships like? What is your family relationships like? And then they're going to look at your esteem needs, your self-esteem, depression levels, anxiety levels. And based on this is where they're going to draw up some type of treatment plan or something like that. So this has also influenced, again, Western ideas of what an organization should look like, what we should look like when we're taking in consideration someone's mental health needs, and those types of things. What we're going to see from a cultural level is that some cultures are going to de-emphasize esteem. Some other cultures are going to put love and belonging before physiological needs. And so we're going to see when we do some cultural comparisons that not necessarily these things fit this triangle that some societies think that some things belong first. I always like the meme that puts this one right here and they put the internet or social media right here. It's kind of a funny take on that, but almost true in some senses. So, so that's the notion of Maslow's theory. I want to kind of hit on Carl Rogers because he gave us a better understanding of what self-actualization is, and I'm not going to necessarily go through all of these terms. Maybe I'll go to, let me just really kind of summarize Carl Rogers, and then if you want to, you can go back to these slides. Okay. What these last three slides emphasized, again, for the sake of time and whatnot, I'm going to simplify them, is that we really have two types of selves. We have a real self and we have an ideal self. Okay. The real self is you behaving right now in the world. It's who you truly, truly are in place, in time, in situation. Your ideal self is the person you think you ought to be. So, straight A student, the most high performing at work, the greatest mother or father, the greatest sibling, the greatest son of the family, those things that we think we should be, the superstar. Okay. And what Carl Rogers noted in his clinical work is that the further and further these are apart, the more dysfunction we see. So if someone has depression, if they're who they think they should be and who they are, there's a huge gap between the two. The severity of their depression symptoms gets worse. Anxiety gets worse. Eating disorders get worse. Okay. And so what Carl Rogers said is that a healthy person, a self-actualized person, is when the real self and the ideal self are one and the same. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you become the superstar. What it means is that you do an honest appraisal of who you are and you come to accept yourself completely. And when I say accept yourself completely, you accept all of your good qualities, all of your bad qualities, all of your great skills, and all of your flaws. You don't deny them at all. Okay. So, going off of this idea, if you think about this in this guise, okay, is that if you completely accept yourself for all that you are, then you can accept other people for completely and totally who they are, for their good qualities, their bad qualities, all of those things. So, for example, this is a person who could look at a pedophile, for example, and say, that is a very negative aspect of that individual. But that does not make the entire individual. There's other aspects of that person, not just the pedophilia. I bring that example up because often pedophilia brings up some very negative images. And the idea of actually being completely self-actualized is, yes, you look at that quality and go, I want to help you with that, but let's not throw the baby out with the washpan. There's other things about this person that makes them who they are. It's a person who works in the prison system who sees there are people who are in there that did very bad things, but they also can have good qualities. Okay. An example of this is when I worked in the prison system, there were women in the women's prison system, there were women who did really awful things, But when I watched them with their children at visitation, they were pretty amazing moms. So it's this ability because you accept yourself completely for who you are. And I'm not saying I do, that's just an example, because I have a long ways to go on this journey. But if you accept completely for who you are as an individual, then you can live a life without quote unquote prejudice. And if you think about this type of person, there's very few. We could probably name a few famous ones like Mother Teresa, um, um, Martin Luther King, um, and a few others. Those are the ones that always come to my mind. So this is the idea of self-actualization. And if you think about it, it's a perfect sense of perfection going back to almost Freudian ideas. Okay. But that's what we're driven towards. Okay. All right. The last, well, not almost the last theory that I want to talk about is more of a modern scientific theory, and it's called trait theory. And this is the last one we'll hit for today. And then we'll get into the cultural basis of this on Tuesday. Trait theory is this notion that we have some specific traits, outgoing, not outgoing, smart, not smart, all those kind of traits that become enduring qualities about the self. Okay. So trait theory states that personality consists of broad, enduring dispositions that lead to characteristic responses. Okay. Probably the most valid version because when trait theory started, I believe the list was like 156 different individual traits that have been examined. Today, I think we have a 32, a 16. I think the MMPI still measures over 30. But the one that, again, we find meets the definition of trait theory as enduring and leads to characteristic responses is what's called the big five factor personality theory. Okay. This is really the only one that has been tested over and over and over again and has the consistent qualities of being enduring and associated with some very specific responses in the individual. So let's take a look at the big five trait theory. If you want to use an acronym, the acronym is OCEAN. Okay. On this, we have what's called openness. And on the other end, if you want to put a term at the other end, is closed. Closed. Okay. Open is a person who seeks out new ideas, seeks out new experiences. It's that friend when you say, hey, I want to do something new this weekend, they're all about it. Um, if you study something and you find counter information to a belief that you have, you change and adapt that belief system to meet the new information that you have. And then on the closed-ended part is that you feel like your ideas, your values are the way it is, and anything else is not valid. Okay, this is someone who is very set in their habits, someone who has to have their day very regimented. Now, these are the extremes of these two, and we're all somewhere in between. But on openness, we do find that there is an age related. We often start life with a very open personality, and as we age, we become more and more closed, quote unquote, minded. So we become more rigid as we age, in a sense. But people who continue to do that notion of lifelong learning, those types of things tend to be less susceptible to this age-related change in this personality factor. The second one is conscientiousness. and I'll just put over here non-conscientious, okay? And if you want to think about conscientious versus whether you're not conscientious, I want you to think about how you prepare for a vacation or a weekend away from home, where you're taking time off of work, okay? If you're the person who makes sure that your house is completely clean, everything is in order, and just in case something happens while you're on vacation, someone can come to your house and figure things out because you've left instructions, you've left everything. And same with work. You leave your office in good condition, everything is set, you've left instructions for your coworkers. You measure high in conscientiousness because what you want to be aware of is the needs of other people in order to be successful, to be there. Now, if on the other hand, you're one of those people who leave your office in a disarray, you leave your home, you throw your clothes in a bag and take off without making the bed or anything like that, you're on the other end of conscientiousness. That really, it's not that you're selfish, it's that you just think that people will figure it out if something happens to me. Okay. Um, the next one is extroversion versus if we put on this other end, it's introversion. Okay. And I do want to spend just a minute on this notion. Okay. The best way to really determine whether you're extroverted or you're introverted is how you get energized. Okay. If you get energized, if you do your best thinking when you're in a group of people talking and interacting with each other, and you leave that social situation energized and extra and ready to go, you're an extrovert. Okay. If, on the other hand, you get energized from being a quiet place for a little while where you can collect your thoughts and collect your ideas, you're an introvert. Okay. So extroversion, you have to be around people because that's what energizes you. Introversion, you get energized by that quiet contemplation that in by yourself. Okay. Um, I think I mentioned on Tuesday, I am more on the introverted end. A lot of my educator friends tend to be on this end of the spectrum, on the extroverted end. And so when they get done teaching a class, they come back to the faculty offices and they're bouncing anywhere, everywhere. They have energy, they have let's go, let's go, let's go. They become the office cheerleaders. When I'm done with the class, I have to close my door and spend just about 30 minutes in my own head to get re-energized for the next task at hand. Okay. And that's really an example of extroversion versus introversion. Now, on the introversion end, there's a common misconception that introverts hate social situations. And that's completely not true. Okay. Even introverts have the need to be in a social place. Can they be that person in the coffee shop, kind of sitting in the corner, just watching everyone else interact with each other? Absolutely. Can there be the person that just does light conversation at a party? Absolutely. But introverts need social interactions just as much as extroverts. People who have anxiety, who do not like being in social situations, they avoid it. That is called shyness, not introversion. Shyness is the anxiety, the not desiring being in a social situation. It gives them anxiety. It gives you kind of this uneasy feeling. Okay. And that's where a lot of people mistake introversion an introvert. Okay. Because both an introvert and an extrovert can have shyness. There are extroverts in the world who are out there that crave social interaction, but they have such overwhelming anxiety about it because either they've been made fun of or because they're bullied that they avoid it. Okay. Now, it is true that the majority of people who are shy tend to measure high on introversion. But like I just said, you can also be extroverted and have shyness. Okay. So the reason why I bring this up is shyness is more associated with things like social awkwardness, those kinds of things, but people assume that they're introverted. And I kind of want to break that bad thinking in the class. Because yes, introverts, if it doesn't include shyness, actually do enjoy going to the local coffee shop, going to the club, doing those things. Um, but they get their energy from that self-reflection, alone time. Okay. Agreeableness versus non-agreeableness. This is agreeable is that you tolerate sensitive, trusting, kind, and warm is more on the agreeable end. Non-agreeable. The way I like to think about agreeableness is this notion of the Karen. Okay. Someone who is highly agreeable probably is not going to measure high on a scale of Karenness. Okay. On the opposite of agreeableness is someone who has very rigid thinking, and expresses it to whoever and gives no regard to how that person feels about it. Okay. Now, this is different than openness. Agreeableness is a social process. Openness is a cognitive process. Okay. Meaning that you can be closed-minded, but still highly agreeable and acceptance for other people's point of views. But you may still maintain a very, very rigid belief system. Okay. And so I don't want you to mistake agreeableness for openness. Okay. All right. The last one is neuroticism versus non-neuroticism, or what's called easygoing. Neurotic people are people who are very anxious, they're irritable, they're temperamental, and they're moody. Um, and those who are not are kind of easygoing. The way that I would measure, if you want to measure yourself on a scale of neuroticism or neurotic, is if you get easily anxious and moody and irritable, and an event or something bad happens to you, you have to react to it in a very irritable, moody way. Um, you're neurotic, okay? Versus easygoing people. So, if you want to think about it this way, a neurotic person, they will see their house burn down. And I'm talking about extremes. They will see their house burn down and they will completely freak out. Their life is going to end. Everything is bad. World sucks. It's against me. That's someone who is highly neurotic. Versus the other extreme, they see their house burn down and they ask someone for some marshmallows, maybe a graham cracker and a piece of chocolate. And they're like, oh, okay. Oh, there goes my house. All right, bye, house. That is someone who is on the opposite end of extreme neuroticism. Okay. And then, of course, we're all somewhere in between there. And so these are the five big factor traits. And again, when we get to the cultural aspect, we will find that culture does influence these five traits, but we find these 5 traits across cultures. Okay. So while culture may control for the number of people who are extroverted versus introverted, for example, individualistic countries like the United States, our populations tend to measure high in extroversion and tend to value extroversion more. However, when we look at countries like Japan and China, they tend to measure more high on the introversion end, and they value introversion more than they do extroversion. Okay. So while these measure consistently across culture, how they're expressed seems to be culturally bound. Okay. And then the last thing that, oh, well, no, I won't because we're too close out of time. So I'm going to stop our